Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to So Custom. Today's video is going to be the making of this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, this is a blended fabric of linen and viscose. Quite a good weight to it, good for a little project like this. And on to the cutting out. This is my back. My fabric underneath is on the fold, and I have one little notch at the centre back at the neck. And on to my front. I have two layers of that fabric underneath my pattern piece, and I have a couple of notches at the top and bottom of my button placket. And on to the construction. So I'm just laying my front over my back at the side seams and pinning. My fabric is right sides together and stitching at my 1 cm seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. So I just need to finish off my edges, and for this top I've decided to fell the seams. So to do that, I'm just going to trim down one side of that seam allowance. So I'm snipping away here about 2/3. So you can see that here. And then pressing the uncut seam allowance over the top of the cut, tucking in those raw edges and pressing again. And once it's all done, this is how it looks and ready to stitch. So I'm stitching right along that crease edge, back stitching at the start, using a little bit of a longer stitch length here, trying to stick to that crease edge the whole way down, and back stitching at the end. So that's how that looks. So from the inside and from the out, nice and neat and tidy. So now that my side seams are joined, I'm ready to finish off my armholes. So for this top, I've decided on a bias finish. So I've just cut myself a strip of fabric on the bias, and I'm pinning one end to the top of the armhole and ready to sew. So stitching here at my 1 cm seam allowance, making tiny little adjustments the whole way around, making sure I'm sticking to my 1 cm seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end, and that's how that looks. So I just need to trim down that seam allowance. That will make the next step much easier. So I'm trimming down about 2/3 of that seam allowance the whole way around. And here, just pressing the bias over the top of that trimmed seam allowance in preparation for understitching. So I'm stitching here through the bias and through that trimmed seam allowance underneath. And this understitching will just help the bias to lie nice and flat in underneath. I'm using a little bit of a longer stitch length, back stitching at the start and the end. So that's how that looks. So now to finish the bias, I just need to fold that raw edge over the top of the stitches I've just sewn, press, fold again and press. And off camera I've just finished off that pressing and ready to stitch. So I'm stitching this time right along that inner crease edge, using that same longer stitch length, back stitching at the start, trying to stick to that crease edge the whole way around, and back stitching at the end. So that's how that looks. So I've given them a bit of a press, and that's my armholes complete. So now I'm ready to tackle my button placket. So I have a little bit of prep work to do here, namely pressing and adding interfacing. So I've just pressed in my 1 cm seam allowance on the edge of the placket, and then I cut myself a strip of interfacing, and I'm pressing it right up against that crease line on the edge of my 1 cm seam allowance. That will just make sure everything's nice and flush and I get a nice crease on my placket. Once my interfacing is in place, folding again and pressing. So that's my placket all prepped. So before I can finish my placket, I need to tackle my neckline. So I have a couple of pieces of facing to add here. So for the front I have 2 pieces and the back 1 piece on the fold. And I just need to finish off the edges of each. So I'm just folding in about half of my seam allowance, pressing, folding again by the same amount and pressing, and then stitching just along that crease edge. This is just going to give me a nice, tidy, clean finish to my facing on the inside. So I've went ahead and done that for each of the edges, and whilst I was there I've just pressed up my 1 centimetre seam allowance along that bottom edge. You can see that here. And ready now to finish off the neckline. So just laying that front facing on top of my bodice, right sides together, making sure my button placket is pushed out of the way and pinning. Exactly the same thing on the back, so laying my facing right sides together with my bodice back and pinning. And stitching here at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. Again, making sure that that placket's out of the way and I'm not sewing into it. And for the back, exactly the same thing again, back stitching at the start, stitching at my 1 centimetre seam allowance and back stitching at the end. So that's how they look. So I just need to trim down those seam allowances. So snipping just at the edge of that seam, and just like the rest, taking off about 2/3 of that seam allowance, pressing the facing away from the bodice, making sure that trimmed seam allowance underneath is butted up against the facing, and ready to understitch. So back stitching at the start, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, back stitching at the end. So that's that done. And I've done exactly the same thing for the back. So that's how they look. So before I can close up the facing, I need to add some ties. So here I've just cut myself 4 ties. I've cut them on the bias and just folding right sides together and pinning and stitching here at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, little pivot at my corner, back stitching at the start and the end. And now I just need to trim off those corners and turn my tie right side out. So just trimming off each of those edges just around that bottom corner. And now to turn my tie right side out, I'm just using a wooden skewer here, pressing the fabric over the top and pulling the whole thing through to the right side. And off camera I've given that a nice press, and this is how it looks. And of course I've done that for all 4 ties and ready to attach to the facing. So I'm just lining up the edge of the tie with the edge of the facing, pinning, doing exactly the same on the back, so lining up one tie with the centre of the facing and the other butted up against that, pinning and ready to stitch. So I'm just stitching along the edge of the tie, back stitching at the start and the end. So that's my ties attached both front and back. So now I can close up my facing. So just folding the facing to the inside, making sure my ties are pushed up out of the way and pinning and ready to stitch. So stitching here using that same longer stitch length, back stitching at the start, trying to stick to that crease edge the whole way across and back stitching at the end. So that's how that looks. Exactly the same thing with the front. So I've just pinned my facing in place and stitching here right along that crease edge, back stitching at the start and the end, and that's my ties all attached. So now to finish off my neckline completely, I just need to gather up my bodice fabric on front and back until I get to the width I want. Once I'm happy, pinning that tie in place and ready to stitch. So just running a stitch line right along the edge of the facing, closing up that facing at its edge and also securing the tie at the same time. So that's all 4 ties done. So I have one more thing I need to do before I can finish off the placket at the front, and that is to stitch up my hem. So I'm just snipping into the hem just underneath the placket at each side by about 1 centimetre, folding up my hem once by about half of my seam allowance, pressing, folding again by the same amount and pressing, and ready to stitch. So starting at the snip at one side, stitching right along that crease edge, using that same little bit of a longer stitch length, back stitching at the start and back stitching at the end. And that's my hem complete. So now that my neckline is finished and my hem is finished, I can close up my placket. So to do that, I'm just folding my placket at that crease, back on itself, making sure the seam allowance is on top and popping in a pin and ready to stitch right along the edge of the hem, back stitching at the start, using a regular stitch length this time and back stitching at the end. So that's how that looks. Exactly the same thing with the neck. So folding right along that crease line, making sure that my seam allowance is on top, pinning and stitching right along the edge of the neck. So that's how that looks. And once both edges are turned right side out, this is how it looks. So it just needs a bit of a press, and now I'm ready to stitch right along that inner edge. So back stitching at the start, using that longer stitch length again, the whole way along that inner crease and back stitching at the end. So that's my placket all fully prepped. It's all stitched down that whole centre front. My facings are all nicely enclosed and my hem enclosed, and ready for buttons and buttonholes. So for the buttonholes, I'm just measuring down from the neck about 1/2 inch, and then from that point at 2.5 inch intervals, popping in a pin as a marker for each and ready to sew my buttonholes. So sewing here just in the normal way. My first buttonhole you can see here is on the horizontal, and the rest will be vertical, so you'll see the next one in a second. So that's how they look, and I'll finish the rest off camera, and this is how they look. And then to open up the buttonholes, I'm just placing a pin at one end and using my seam ripper to open up that fabric in between the threads. And then to secure those threads, I'm just popping in a little bit of fray check. And once that's all dry, I'm ready to mark where I want my buttons to be. So I've just pinned my placket together and just using my fabric pen here and placing a dot right at the center of the buttonhole. So that's how that looks. And off camera, I've just sewn on just some really standard shirt buttons. And with that, this little top is complete. So I've got my placket with my buttonholes and buttons, got that hem all nicely in place, gathers around the neck front and back, my side seams all nicely felled, and those lovely ties across the shoulder. And this is what it looks like on. So this is just a really casual little summer top, super comfortable. I love all the details on this. I love the neckline, both front and back, those beautiful gathers, lovely ties across the shoulder. And if you follow me on Instagram, you'll have seen the inspiration for this one. You'll have also seen another version of this made up in a viscose fabric, super soft, floaty, drapey fabric that works so well with this pattern. Love it.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you guys in my next one. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye folks!